And now, to introduce our speaker and to tell us more about this exciting opportunity, please help me welcome Bryce Seidel, President and CEO of the Pacific Science Center.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The Dead Sea Scrolls have fascinated much of the world since their discovery in 1947, and they're captivating our city of Seattle today. They've given the world an unprecedented insight into a time and place in history that saw the development of Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity. The exhibit at the Science Center will take us through the rich and complex stories of history and show how modern sciences are helping us unlock the secrets of the origins of our culture. Today we're very fortunate to having Dr. Martin Abegg, one of the world's foremost scholars working on the Dead Sea Scrolls. You received a complete biography in your newsletter, I believe. He serves as the Ben Zion Professor of Dead Sea Scroll Studies and Director of the Master's Program in Biblical Studies at Trinity Western University in Langley, British Columbia. He's also the co-director of the Dead Sea Scrolls Institute at Trinity Western. Suffice it to say, his academic credentials are outstanding. Beyond his academic credentials, Marty's an extraordinary person. An outdoorsman and former manager of an industrial supply business in Seattle, he became captivated with the story of the scrolls and has risen to the top of his field through his research, his publications, and his presentations. With scholarship as his basis, he's able to talk with the general public about the scrolls in a manner that just simply sucks you into his subject matter with his enthusiasm and a style that lacks any pretension. He's been a huge help to Pacific Science Center during our creation of this exhibit, and he will be one of the headline speakers at our Town Hall Lecture Series on October 11th. Please welcome Dr. Marty Abegg.
Thank you very much. Well, you know, Ben and I met before the luncheon, and I didn't understand what he told me his part in the program was, and I understand now, Ben. That was quite a warm-up act. I thank you very much. That was very entertaining. The Dead Sea Scrolls. I am going to give us all just a Dead Sea Scrolls 101, as it were. I have been warned that this group loves to ask questions, and you probably all came loaded for bear, and I only have a few minutes to speak, so I am going to go quite quickly through some of the facts, just the facts, ma'am, as Joe Friday would say, and then open it up for the floor so that you can ask questions. I do find that questions from the floor dealing with the Dead Sea Scrolls almost always send the discussion into some very interesting areas, so I don't want to miss that, and I know you don't want to either. So let me just lay the groundwork here for a few minutes so that you all know what it is we're dealing with when we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I do find that most of us know something about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but not very many of us know that much about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I was speaking in Indiana and was to speak at a church in the evening, and this young lad came up to me. He was about 6 years old. He said he was so excited that I was speaking that evening, and it was only later that his parents told me that he thought I was speaking on the Dead Sea Squirrels. Well, that was his connection to the scrolls. I had a fellow come up to me after a lecture and said, boy, it must be really great to work on the Grateful Dead scrolls. And that, so we all have something to bring to the table when it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls. But let me just give us a little bit more so that we're all on the kind of the same wavelength here, and then open it up for some questions. The Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, you probably know the story of the shepherd boy throwing the rock in the cave. Sometime in 1947, the scrolls were found by accident by a Bedouin shepherd boy, and they came to the knowledge of the scholarly world, both in Israel and then in the West, in 1948. It was big news at that time, a couple of years before I was born. I think the byline is the Dead Sea Scrolls hit North America in about 1955. But I didn't discover them until about 1986. That's when I began my serious study of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But 47 is the very beginning. The Cave 1 that some of the most interesting and complete scrolls came from was found in 47. The last of the scroll caves was found in 1956. So we have a 10-year period there that the archaeologists were just rewarded with their efforts scouring the cliff faces looking for caves. Not much has been found since, a few things, but that was the peak period And we are still waiting, actually, for a couple of volumes of scroll fragments still today. So it has taken over 50 years for the material to come out, and it's wonderful, really. It really is amazing for those of us that work on this material to have the Science Center actually sponsor this exhibit. So 1956 is the end of the scroll discovery. What are the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls date back to a time period between the middle of the 3rd century BCE up until about 70 CE. So a little bit more than 300 years. We have manuscripts that date as early as the 3rd century up to the 1st century CE. That's a very important time for a number of reasons. You think of the beginnings, the advent of Christianity, for example, in the 1st century, the advent of Rabbinic Judaism, normative Judaism, as we know today, began in those times as well. So for the first time, we have material that give us a window into that time period that we just did not have before. And what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? What do they tell us? Well, first of all, we have about 900 manuscripts. And lest you think that we have 900 scrolls that you could unroll like such, when you come to the Science Center, you'll see that most of the scrolls are quite fragmentary. As you can imagine, if you hid some books out in the backyard for 2,000 years and came back to pick them up, they'd probably be in pretty poor shape. Well, the scrolls, it's amazing that we have what we have, 900 fragmentary manuscripts. 200 of those manuscripts are Hebrew Bible. And that is the first point of importance. There will be several that we'll touch on. We have manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible that are 1,000 years older now than anything that we had previously. The oldest complete manuscript of the Hebrew Bible dates to 1008 of this era. In other words, it isn't even 1,000 years old. So the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls pushed the study of the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, back over 1,000 years. And you can imagine the feeding frenzy that has caused among Old Testament and Hebrew Bible circles as we try to digest that information. So Hebrew Bible, that is a very important aspect of the scrolls, and about 200 of the scrolls are directly related. The other 700 scrolls are what we might call sectarian literature. There are no novels, there are no shopping lists, there are no marriage certificates, there are no inventory lists. These are all religious documents, more or less, telling about the religious climate of Palestine in the first and second century BCE through the 1st century CE. Again, a very important time. And those documents are also very important because they tell us about the roots of Christianity. They tell us about the roots of Judaism. They tell us material that we had no access to before. And they do make a difference in what we think about both of these world religions to this day. To compare the guidebooks, the handbooks that were available back in the 50s to the handbooks that have had to have been rewritten over the past years because of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you would see two major things that have changed. First of all, Christianity. Christianity is much more Jewish in its roots than we had ever known before. This group, their theological temperature, their interest in the biblical texts and finding themselves within the biblical texts became the interest of the early Christian church as well. And for Judaism, they tell us that Judaism is much more varied in antiquity than we knew before. The monolithic kind of sense that we had of Judaism prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has changed dramatically. There was a revolution, really, in Jewish studies in the 1970s and 80s, reflecting what we discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we now know that Judaism of this time period was really quite varied in faith and practice. So those, painting with broad strokes, those are the two areas that we see within the sectarian or non-biblical scrolls. So again, 3 points really that I'd like to leave with you, and then we'll open it up for questions here. We have the Hebrew Bible, oldest biblical manuscripts in existence. And in the exhibit at the Science Center, there are 5 scrolls related to the Hebrew Bible. Oldest copy of Genesis, Exodus, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and a very large and beautiful piece of the Psalm scroll that came out of Cave 11. There are 5 sectarian scrolls, and they tell a very interesting story, kind of subdividing what we've talked about as the backdrop for Christianity and Judaism here. They tell us something of the calendar that was followed in that time, and we still have an interest in time. You know, when is Hanukkah, for example? When do we celebrate Christmas? How in the world do we figure out when Easter is? You know, those kinds of questions we still have to this day. And the calendar that is on display at the Science Center is quite interesting and reveals a very interesting take on the calendar that has been lost in antiquity but is now known by means of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They wanted to know what does the Bible tell about us? You know, how do we fit in the biblical story? And there's a commentary on display at the Science Center that gives us a bit of this information. They wanted to know how the world is going to end. And there is a manuscript that is on display at the Science Center that is of particular interest to me because it is a manuscript I've actually written a couple of articles on and have never seen in person, and I didn't quite make it in there this morning because of the media frenzy, but I will probably this afternoon or this evening. And that is a scroll that is called the War Text and talks about the coming of the Messiah at the end of the age and God's dealing with the evil of the world and raising up righteousness. And finally, there is a text that many of us in religious traditions can relate to. How do we live? And that is a community document that is on display at the Science Center. So that just gives you a snapshot of what you might see if you do, and I challenge you, you must go see the display. It is a beautiful thing to behold. So, do I have 12 minutes? Is that what I've got left? I'm going to open it up for questions now. Hopefully you came with some things that you'd like to know about the scrolls, and I will open to the floor now.
Here's our microphone team here. There's Larry.
There we go.
And Laura's got a microphone, and we've got, if you'd like to ask a question, just leap to your feet.
Here we go over here. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious if you know why they put the scrolls in the caves that they put them in. What was the purpose of that?
That's a very good question, and that's one of those questions that we probably will never know the entire answer to. There are several theories. One is that the cave that the largest amount of the scrolls came from, Cave 4, was an artificial cave and may have been a library in antiquity. You know, it was actually dug out of the cliff face. It was fitted with shelves, and the scrolls placed on those shelves in antiquity. Sometime in the past, they came down and were buried in the dust in the floor. That's a possibility. The other theory is that as Jerusalem was in danger of being overrun by the Romans from the late 60s to 70 CE, the scrolls were actually hidden in the caves for safekeeping. And the community that hid them, never was able to come back and claim them because of the Roman conquest of Palestine. That's what we think, but we're waiting for more information to say better. Very good question.
Could you distinguish the scroll from the Codex for us, please? And then also talk a little bit about the community of Qumran. What do we know now about Qumran?
Yes, the scroll and the Codex. Well, scrolls are, you probably have the picture maybe of the town crier, with the scroll this way. Actually, the Dead Sea Scrolls we unroll this way. And if you can imagine, if this were a meeting of the Qumranites and we all had our scrolls with you, and I asked you to turn to Psalm 119, verse 73, the rolling of the scrolls out across the tables and the dribbling down the aisles, they're quite clumsy things to work with. So sometime later, and you may actually know the date better than I, someone invented the book. And the book was a great invention. Should have taken a copyright out on the book. Would have made a mint. But books, things that you could actually turn the pages and hold in one place in your lap. The scrolls, there are no codexes among the scrolls. That was a later invention. Do you know the date of that, by the way? Is that?
And the letters of Paul.
Okay, so probably pre-Christian. It could have been, if they would have been cutting edge sort of community, they might have had access to it, but they did not. Yeah, so what do we know about the community of Qumran? This is really a somewhat of a controversial question because we don't know for absolute sure that the community, the archaeological site, is actually tied to the scrolls, but most scholars believe that it is because of commonality in pottery between the archaeological site and the caves where the scrolls were hidden, and coins, time period is right. And if that is true, then the community, we have to ask the question, what did they do what did they do there? And that brings another question. Who was it that collected these scrolls and hid them in the caves? And again, scholars feel that a group of Jewish community by the name of Essenes, we know that from Josephus' writings, probably collected and stored the scrolls in these caves, and then it was probably the Essenes, if the connection has been made rightly to the archaeological site, that actually had some sort of community site there on the plateau above the Dead Sea at the northwest corner of the Dead Sea, not too far from the caves. But those things are still being studied to this day. As you attend the exhibit, you'll see in the opening section of the exhibit what we do know about the connection of the site to the caves where the scrolls were stored or put for safekeeping, and what we do know about the possible connection of the Essenes to the site. And then we can all gather together, and I'll ask you what you think. Okay.
I believe there's been some suggestion that the scrolls suggest the Bible may have been broader or have other books that have since been excised. Can you make some comment on that, please?
That's a very good question. You know, what do the scrolls actually tell us about the Bible? I told you that it pushes the study of the Bible and the biblical text back 1,000 years. How about the books in the Bible? Well, if you've read the handbooks on the scrolls, you know that the book of Esther is missing from the scroll collection. But a little bit of trivia, there are two other books that are also missing as well. First Chronicles is not found in the caves, although Second Chronicles was, so we assume that First Chronicles was there. And also Nehemiah was not found in the scroll caves, but Ezra was. So they're kind of a dynamic duo, as it were, so we assume that Nehemiah was there as well. So how about Esther? Esther probably wasn't considered canonical by the Dead Sea Scroll community. And how do we know that? Because Esther includes the origins of the Jewish festival known as Purim. And we have some 24 calendars that plot out all the festival days that they celebrated, and Purim is not included in the festival list. So they probably did not consider Esther to be biblical. However, there were a couple of other books that were included in large numbers and probably were biblical. A book by the name of Enoch, for example, that is quoted in the New Testament book of Jude, and also a book by the name of Jubilees, which was found in some dozen copies. So, and it was also quoted by name in some of the sectarian materials. So on one side, their Bible may have been a little smaller than ours, but on the other side, it was probably a little bit larger too.
The Old Testament had been translated into Greek for the Jews of the diaspora, and I read that there are some Greek segments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Any reference to a Septuagint translation in those fragments? And how about the veracity of the translation in comparison to the original Jewish?
I didn't hear the last part of that question, I'm sorry.
About the veracity of the translation to the original text.
Right. Okay, well, let's start there because that's another part of this question about what we find from the biblical manuscripts. How does the text look? You know, not just what are the books in the text, but how does the text look? Painting with broad strokes, it is amazing how accurately the text was copied over those 1,000 years that we didn't know about until the scrolls were found. So we've pushed the history of the study of the Hebrew Bible back 1,000 years, and in some scrolls, like for example the Genesis scroll that is on display at the Science Center, there are 3 differences, and they're all spelling differences. and it's very similar to the difference as I would spell the word color with a U in Canada, you would spell it without in the States, same sort of thing. So no difference in meaning whatsoever. The Exodus scroll, on the other hand, has some more interesting differences, and none of them are theological by any means. Different prepositions, repetition of the word and, where we would say this, and this. They say this, and this, that sort of thing. The God of Isaac, the God of Abraham, and the God of Jacob rather than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So little differences, certainly not that meaningful. There are more interesting differences, like the Psalm scroll that is on display. The portion of the Psalm scroll represented by Psalm 145 is not on display, but that's an interesting part of the scroll, as there is a missing verse in our Hebrew text, the traditional Hebrew text. It's an acrostic psalm, right? So it starts with Aleph and it goes through Tav, but it does not have the letter Nun, which is our N. And the scroll from Cave 11, which is on display at the Science Center, has that missing N verse, which is quite interesting. So there will be some changes that will occur. Probably a question that would arise from this: how is it going to change our English translations? And there already are some changes. Now, if you use the KJV or Jewish Publication Society text, you won't see changes because of their philosophy of translation. But if you use the NIV, the NRSV, the NASB, there are already changes. If you use the NRSV, take a look at Psalm 145 and verse 13, and you'll see that missing N verse. Now, the other part of your question was about the Greek scrolls. Yes, there are 4 Greek biblical scrolls that were found in the caves, all of them Septuagintal in nature, so that Greek translation that was done for diaspora Jews. There are also about 20-some non-biblical Greek scrolls that were found in the caves, and that brings the whole question about language. I actually have the numbers here. There are, where is it? There it is. 133 Aramaic sectarian manuscripts, 550 Hebrew, and 22 Greek. So Mel Gibson, remember The Passion? What language did Jesus speak? I wonder if he didn't speak Hebrew. According to these figures, and that's one of the things that the Scrolls has done as well. It has made us aware of the fact that Hebrew was a living language during this time. It hadn't died out, as some scholars had believed.
Hopefully this is short. You said that there was a lot of, in the early Christianity, a lot of the beliefs and practices and whatever from Judaism that continued over. Could you tell us specifically what some of those were, and then is there any indication when those were dropped along the way?
Okay, very good. Well, I think to answer the last question first, there were, as we said, the scrolls have shown us that Judaism was much more varied in antiquity than we had thought. So the Judaism that we know today is probably related to the Pharisaic brand of Judaism in antiquity, and the Essenes and the Sadducees and other groups fell by the wayside sometime during the diaspora. So then going back to the question about the connection to Christianity, this group that hid the scrolls in the caves was a very apocalyptic sort of group. They were very interested in what God was going to do at the end of time. Now, Jews of many stripes have been interested in that, but this group especially so, and that did work its way into the early Christian texts as well. And one aspect of that is their messianic fervor. They were looking for a Messiah. And in fact, they were looking for 2 Messiahs, a Messiah that was a priest and a Messiah that was a king. And that also is related to the New Testament. And there I will stop. Thanks, David.
That was fabulous. That was fabulous. That was good. Thank you. Thanks, Marty. Well, I don't think there's any question that the professor could go on and we could go on. That was fabulous. And just one more reminder, you can sign up for a special opportunity here. More than 65 Rotarians from around the district have already signed up, so take advantage of this opportunity. I want to thank all of today's program participants. I want to welcome all our visitors one more time. And Dick Green, thank you, sir. Thanks for your nearly 50 years of perfect attendance, and more than that, thanks for your leadership. We're grateful. Well, here's a surprise. Next week, we're at the Sheraton. We haven't been at the Sheraton for more than a year. You might want to wear your hard hats. James Wong is going to give us a world-class tour of the Seattle Rotary website. Some of us need that. And we're also going to hear from Kath Bruner. She's going to give us a show and tell on public art and public places. This week, pretty good rule number 12. It's a short one. Call your mom. And please allow me to introduce my mom. She taught me the rules, and she'd be the first one to tell you I'm not all that good on rule number 12. My mom is with us today. Please stand up, Mom. Thank you. See you next week at the Sheraton. We are adjourned.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, now providing return-to-work services that help get absent employees back to their jobs. Healthy employees produce healthy companies at First Choice Health. And by Enterprise Seattle. For over 35 years, Enterprise Seattle has provided client-based economic development services to businesses throughout King County and its 39 cities. More information on Enterprise Seattle and how they help businesses grow and prosper can be found at www.enterpriseseattle.org.